So welcome everyone to this episode of Stories for Healing. I want to thank you all for coming back for this episode. I know many of you have been here many times, and I want to encourage everyone to share these stories, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube. And today we have a very special guest, Erica Taraporevala, who is a storyteller from India. And she has a couple of stories for us today. So Erica, please tell us a story.
So thank you, Jim. Happy to be here as usual. I have two stories today. One is a Sufi story by Rumi, and it has been retold by Kamla Kapoor in her book called A Pilgrimage to Paradise. Yeah. And the second story is a tale from Buddha's life. So the story is called The Mirror. And one day, the Prophet Muhammad was sitting under a date palm tree, along with people, some his followers and some not. They were all drinking fresh goat's milk, still hot from the warm from the udder, and dates fresh from the trees. And there was a gentle breeze, and the sun was setting, and the sky had turned a dark gray with shades of blue and pink, and the thin ribbon of the new moon ascended the sky with Venus in its hollow. It was a peaceful evening, and the men murmured amongst themselves, when suddenly a rude voice spoke up and said, Muhammad, your grandfather, he was an ugly man. Your father was an ugly man, and you are an ugly man. They all turned, and it was Jal. He had been getting progressively ruder in the past few months. And Haider, a young follower of Muhammad, immediately took out his sword from his sheath and was about to plunge it into the rude man's chest. When the Prophet said, you are right, Jal. You speak the truth. Haider did not know what to do. He could not kill the man because the Prophet had spoken. So reluctantly, he put his sword back into the sheath. Again, people started talking, and slowly things quietened down. And then another voice spoke up. And this time it was the elderly Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr said, Muhammad, your grandfather, he was a beautiful and great man. And so was your father, and so are you. And Muhammad looked at Abu Bakr and said, Abu Bakr, you speak the truth. Now Haider was very confused. He looked at Muhammad and he said, how can both of them be true? When they speak two radical opposites, one says you are ugly, the other says you are beautiful. Both cannot be true at the same time. Explain to me what has happened just now. And so the Prophet says, you know, Haider, people wear different glasses. Some wear blue glasses and some wear red glasses. And the world appears blue to those who wear blue glasses and red to those who wear red glasses. And nobody is wrong. But Haider was young. He was an idealistic young man. And he said, I am not interested in this blue truth and red truth. Are you telling me there is no one single truth which trumps all these truths? The Prophet looked at Haider and smiled. And he said, Haider, if that is the truth that you want, then that is not to be found here. You cannot look to Jar or Abu Bakr for that kind of truth. If you want that truth, then polish your heart till it becomes transparent like glass. And then the truth which cannot be spoken will shine through you. So that is the first story. The second story is from the life of the Buddha. Maybe a little imagined, but mostly there is the base story. Gate gate paragate parasam gate bodhi swaha. The Buddha sat under the shade of a large peepal tree. It was a cold evening, and his disciples sat around him. And he was speaking. He was saying, "No man can call himself a Brahmin by virtue of his birth alone. Only a man who owns nothing, covets nothing, who is not, who has moved beyond thirst and fear, only such a man can be called a Brahmin. And anyone, irrespective of where he was born, can aspire for this state of being, can work towards this state of being through their individual effort." Now, there was a disciple called Upala, and whenever he heard his master say these things, he couldn't help but a smile would appear on his face. Because in the outside world, he was a Shudra. And he looked to his left. To his left sat Anand, and to his right sat Mahakashyap. Anand in the outer world was a Kshatriya, a prince. And towards his right, Mahakashyap was a Brahmin. And they all sat together side by side over here. But in the outer world, Upala would have never been able to do that. He belonged to this caste called Shudra only by virtue of his birth. A caste where people had been told for generations that they were not good enough, who had been given no access to any resource whatsoever, no education, no arms, no wealth, even for subsistence. Their only value seemed to be in serving the privileged upper castes. And for that too, they had no right to ask for sustenance. They had to be happy with what was thrown to them from a distance, lest they polluted the upper castes. He knew that in the outer world, he would have had to keep his distance from a man like Mahakashyap, so that his shadow did not touch the shadow of the other man, or he could be beaten or even killed. But here, at the feet of the Buddha, they all sat side by side, brothers of a Sangha, with equal access to dignity, to food, to shelter, clothing, and wisdom, and with equal right to pursue nirvana. Of course, it made him smile. It was because of these very teachings that the Buddha was liked, and his, there were more and more people coming to him every day. But these very words of equality and rights, while they gave pleasure to some, irritated others who did not want their privileges to be taken away from them. And one such man sat there amongst them that day, and he chose this moment to stand up and spit at the Buddha. The disciples got up and they were about to hold him when the Buddha stopped them. And the disciples looked on while they saw this man seething with anger and hatred and looking defiantly at the Buddha. And the Buddha looking back at him calmly with gentle, compassionate eyes. And all that the Buddha said was, What next? The man was confused. The spitter was confused. He had expected anger, maybe some violence. At least, at the very least, he expected to be scoffed at. But then what? He did not know what to do with that. So he turned and walked away as fast as he could. And Ananda, who was one of the Buddha's closest disciples, looked at Buddha and said, "Why did you let him go? And tomorrow people will be, emboldened to do even worse things. And what did you mean by what next? What did you want him to do next? He had already spat on you. What else did you want?" "It's not right what you did," he said. Then the Buddha said, "But, when a man spits at you, he wants to say, he has a lot to say to you. And our conversation is not over yet." And so I asked him, "What next?" Anyway, Anand was not very convinced, but what could he do? Buddha had spoken. The man, the spitter, had gone back home, and that night he could not sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, and all the stories that he had heard about the Buddha, of how evil he was and how he was provoking the youngsters and he was leading them away from dharma with his wrong teachings. The stories popped up again and again, trying to confuse him. But those eyes that had looked right into his soul, cut through all those stories. And he knew in his heart of hearts that this was an enlightened man, a Buddha. And he, fool that he was, had spat on the Buddha. He waited anxiously for the break of dawn. In the early hours, even before the first bird had chirped, he rushed back to the Buddha and he fell at his feet. And the Buddha looked at him and said, "What next?" And he said, "Forgive me. Forgive me for what I did yesterday." The Buddha said, "Forgive you? Forgive you for what? There is nothing constant over here. There's nothing constant about you. There's nothing constant about me. We are ever changing. We are like rivers. You could be standing on the bank and you look at it and you think it's the same river, but it changes from moment to moment because the water is flowing through. And what is a river without water? The man you spat at, that man is no longer here. I may look like him, but I am not the same man. So many hours have passed in between and I have changed. And so have you. I can see clearly. Yesterday I had seen a man writhing with anger. Today I see a man asking for forgiveness. You cannot be the same man. So look here. The man who had spat is not here. The man who was spitten on is not here. We are two different people. Come, let's sit together and talk of other things." And the man sat at the feet of Buddha and they spoke. He spoke of things which nobody else knew. And slowly, as the sun came up, the other disciples came around and together they sat around the tree and their voices rose up to the skies. Gate, gate, para gate, para samgate, bodhisvaha.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Two beautiful stories from such different traditions with a similar message. Similar message. I was struck in the second story about the Buddha that he didn't say what the man did was all right to do. He just said it was no longer true. It was no longer reality. Well, the world had shifted since then.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, that's not something that we normally think of as a way of moving on past difficult relationships, but what a treasure if we can do that. What a treasure.
Yeah.
How did that story come to you? How did you come across that story?
Which one? The Buddha?
The second, about the Buddha. Yeah.
So I was thinking about it. I wanted to tell stories from different traditions because, like, if you look at it, the life trajectory of the Prophet and the Buddha are totally different. And you look at the Quran and you look at his teachings of the Buddha, they may not seem very similar, but at its very core, they both speak to looking inwards for the answer.
Yeah.
Polish yourself. Yeah. You can. So there were many stories we know in general, people know his life story in India, I think. So you choose from it. And I thought this one.
So they were real, and obviously they were chosen to go together, but it wasn't that one suddenly spoke to you as a pair, that these two would go together well.
I was looking for a pair.
Yeah.
To go.
Yeah. Well, you found a nicely matched pair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, folks, we have another episode of Stories for Healing. And as has been my kind of dream and desire all along, we have not only stories from around the world, but storytellers from around the world, and even stories from entirely different traditions from the same storyteller. How wonderful is that? I want to remind you that we have these stories broadcast live on Facebook every weekday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, US. And they're all archived on the YouTube playlist that's also mentioned on that same page. I want to encourage you to share the stories with others, but more importantly, to maybe polish your own heart a little bit. It's something we all can do. And it takes time and it takes work, but it's well worth the effort. So thanks again for visiting us in Stories for Healing.